So let's talk about commercial viability. On the surface, it's what is marketable, what can a record label sell, what makes something a product. Well, that's one way to look at it, but ultimately, let's expand it. Let's take commercially viable and just sort of look at it as what is appealing. What about the process of making a record and producing a record makes something appealing? Well, you got to look at. There's a lot of different things you got to look at, but so let's start more on an internal level with the intention that the artist wants to have for their career. Now, an artist may want to have radio hits and go play shows to an audience that they've, gained through a radio single, that kind of success. But that's just one avenue. And actually, radio is kind of an older format. We're much more in the world of streaming, so that's a slightly different consideration. In a radio format, the things that you're going to get told and have to consider are your song shouldn't be more than 3.5 minutes. It should have a short and engaging introduction to the song, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be musical. If you start on a verse, it's just that first lyric or that first vocal just needs to draw the listener in. You want to get to the chorus before a minute has passed. You don't really want musical sections that are too long. I mean, and I'm talking about like current modern radio. If you look at the radio formats of the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, there's different criteria, but we're kind of focusing on now. Well, to be commercially viable, to have an opportunity in that space, then those are the things you need to think about. If you make a song that's 5 minutes long, there's a really good chance that you won't get on the radio. So that's something to consider. Spotify. Spotify keeps analytics and shares them with record labels. And so this becomes a topic of discussion where you have skip rates. And it's not just Spotify, it's just all kinds of online consumption. YouTube would be another platform, medium, where if you don't have the listener's attention within the first 7 to 14 seconds, I think are the numbers, then your music will get skipped. So what does that say? Well, you need to consider these things in terms of if you want to make a record that has that type of opportunity. Now, if you're an artist that is more concerned about or would like to have a career based more on touring and performing, well, then you don't necessarily need to follow those same guidelines, because you can have a 5-minute song or a 10-minute song, really, as long as you have 5 or 10 minutes of music that engages the listener. That's fine. You can have a great career. There are plenty of successful artists that have never had a radio hit. They have kind of a cult following or just a really strong fan base, and they go out and they engage with their fan base a lot. They go and perform. So sort of, I mean, talking about all these things, it's what is commercially viable. It is, in terms of record making, it's the considerations that you need to have when you're putting together a piece of music or a record. You want to keep the listener engaged, and you want to have something that isn't overly repetitive. Repetition in music is is something we love too, but it has to feel engaging. I've been stuck on this song by Tamia. It's called "Leave It Smoking." It's like I guess you would call it's kind of a dancey R&B song. It's very soulful, but it's one drum loop, it's one drum pattern, but it's very danceable and engaging, and there's a lot of the instrumentation. There's a couple keyboards on it, a bass, and her vocals. There are a lot of vocal layers at times. The song is like a chorus the whole time. It moves through all these hooks, but the foundation of it, that drum pattern, it's the same the whole time, and it's everything else that works through the arrangement that changes and makes it powerful. So repetition in music is a great thing, but it has to. But even though there's a very repetitious part about that song and that production, the vocal hooks are constantly coming and going and changing, and the way the instrumentation plays off of it, it keeps you moving and engaged the whole time. So does that necessarily make it a radio hit or a Spotify hit or YouTube hit? I don't know, but it makes it viable. It makes it a great record. And these things are important considerations when you are figuring out how you're going to execute your record and your production. You need to think about who you want your audience to be and how you want to go out and engage your audience. Something I come across when I'm working on a structure or an arrangement with an artist in the studio is navigating the discussions of when maybe a section is too long. You come across that more often than a section being too short, or a section that doesn't exist. I mean, maybe you feel like after the first chorus there's a bit of music that's needed, so you need to kind of come up with some new music, or a new section of the song, or maybe you're able to borrow something from somewhere else in the song, or maybe instead of the chorus going right into the verse, maybe you start the verse, but the singing doesn't start away. You just kind of create a little bit of space. But the point I was trying to make is that it's going to be really hard to draw someone in unless there's an element of it that makes that beginning of the song really engaging. Like the beat is really danceable, and you just want to establish that vibe. The electronic music, EDM music, that you don't have vocals until certain sections, like later hooks in the song or later sections of the song. You don't. It's some types of music that's the vibe, but you have to. Often I have these conversations with artists, and you're working on a song where it's like, well, we don't need this bridge to be this long. We just need it doesn't need to be 16 measures. It can be 8 measures. We don't need to go because we don't need to go through this progression twice. It sort of loses momentum and interest in the second half. Sometimes the consideration for being commercially viable is in the instrumentation choices. Take, for instance, James Bay's record. His first record, he was coming from, it wasn't very widely known at all, but he did not have a band. He didn't have a band sound built around him. He was a singer-songwriter who played acoustic guitar. I mean, the desire was to have something that sounded a bit bigger and more organic around a band sound, but he didn't really have that going into that project, and so the choices that were made sort of stayed true to where the song started, but they they were done in such a way that it wasn't too rock. That the production, even though it's bass, drums, and electric guitar, it was sort of decisions were made to not make it too rock, to keep it in the sort of the singer-songwriter realm, a little bit more open and contemporary. Keep the focus on the song and James' voice, and not put it too far in sort of a rock category. Make it too rock and roll sounding. There's elements of that, but it comes down to like some of the choices we made to not have the guitars be overly distorted, or too many layers of guitars, and just sort of some of the tonality of things, and how dense some of the instrumentation and choices were. Putting a focus on the voice and the song, and making that bridging from the solo acoustic origins of the songs to making them full band, bigger productions. So in the instance of James Bay and making that record commercially viable, taking a solo acoustic artist, sort of troubadour, singer-songwriter, and creating a sound and a platform for him that could go to radio, and that would also translate to him playing in front of larger audiences, and really filling a room. The commercial viability had to sort of be weighed into that, and what will serve his songs, showcase his voice, his guitar playing, but make a song like Hold Back the River, and Let It Go, and Craving. Make these songs that have a bit of a different feel to them, different production aesthetic across those songs. What will make that feel like a band sound, but will make it feel like that it will appeal to a lot of people. The considerations there were to not make it too rock and roll, because if Hold Back the River was made to be too much of a rock song, it's a little bit more soulful. It is in the rock genre, but it's not like a hard rock song. That wouldn't have, obviously you need to serve the song first, but that would not have sat well on the same album as Let It Go, which is much simpler. It's based primarily around a single guitar, and a vocal performance. There's drums and bass and vocals and another guitar part that comes in, but it's much simpler. And the sound of that record, Let It Go, doesn't have a full drum set the way some of the other songs have, but it's like tying all those things together, making it commercially viable, serving the artist. These are the things you need to consider, and be able to understand where the audience, the most powerful way to reach the largest audience. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say that being commercially viable, as I sort of defined it earlier, it's not necessarily the success of selling a lot of records. It's just the success of engaging an audience and being accessible, relatable. So, well, let's just drop the commercial part of it. Let's just say it as being viable. It's important that that's a big consideration, and understanding where your vision is for how you want your career to unfold. I don't think anything that we've heard and been influenced by as listeners and musicians and inspired to be in music at least in the majority, it's because of popular music. It's because of records and songs that were made that a lot of people have heard. And that doesn't mean that you're a sellout. It's not about selling out. It's not about conforming to something else. It's not conforming to what the radio model is or what the skip rate of Spotify is. Those are things to consider if that's where you want your music to have an opportunity.